So my name is Rhianna Hohbein, and I will be presenting a component of my research proposal entitled Weaving Networks into Andean Bear Conservation. I'm co-advised by Drs. Nate Nimmelink and Bob Cooper in the Warnell School of Forestry. And I'd like to start with a quote from Charles Darwin. In the long history of humankind, and animal kind too, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. So we all know that collaboration can be integral to conservation, especially on the landscape scale. And yet relatively little research has examined how best to foster productive relationships among organizations, agencies, individuals with overlapping or even potentially competing interests. And of course, some collaborations fail. We've all heard of ambitious endeavors where they tried to work together and then participants end up walking away extremely frustrated and having squandered a lot of their time and resources. So we need research to answer some of these questions. Social network analysis is a tool that's been used more and more increasingly to answer some of these questions about collaboration. So despite that really quick overview of social networks that you received in the last presentation, I'm going to go into one more example to demonstrate the concept to a lot of you who aren't familiar in the room. So if you don't immediately recognize this, it means that you are not a fan of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That's okay for these purposes, though you should watch them. These are characters that appeared specifically in the novels of Return of the King. These researchers examined the dialogue of those books and were able to construct a social network analysis. So again, these are all characters. They're linked together by lines. That means they indicated some dialogue at some point during the story. Those that have thicker lines connecting them exchanged more dialogue. Something you can also tell is the number of communication ties an individual has by having their name enlarged. So at least from a structural perspective, Gandalf and Theoden King were two of the most central characters to Return of the King. You can also see that there's some substructuring going on. In this case, it's obviously because these characters occurred in different settings as the stories unfolded. So from an empirical perspective, social networks can be really handy because it allows you to quantitatively assess communication between individuals. And so what this means is you would be able to compare different networks across different environments or that work on different species conservation, etc. And so you do social network analyses and you're able to produce some metrics which you can then compare. So I chose a couple of examples that are a little bit simpler to explain, but centrality is one social network metric, and it is an indicator of the degree to which one individual holds the majority of the communication ties within a network. Cohesion is the ratio of network ties that are present relative to those that are theoretically possible in any given network. So ideally, you would be able to answer the question, what is the optimum network structure? What best produces conservation outcomes in this specific case? And unfortunately, where we're standing right now is this very, very common answer of, it depends. And so a couple of examples, for instance, is that higher centrality could be beneficial to a conservation network that is dealing with a rather simple problem and they just need a leader who can effectively delegate tasks to the rest of the network. However, if you're dealing with a really complex conservation issue and you need lots of people putting their heads together to come up with an innovative solution, higher centrality can become an issue. Cohesion even, which intuitively seems like a good thing, can start to become a problem beyond a point if people are so busy maintaining their communication ties that they don't have time to get any work done. And I know that there are a couple faculty that might be able to commiserate with that kind of problem sometimes. But nevertheless, we're trying to answer some of these questions about context. When does a specific network structure benefit conservation and when it doesn't? So that brings me to my very own research context. I'll start with an introduction of the study species since it's unfamiliar to a lot of people. The Andean bear is also called the spectacled bear, is the only bear residing in South America and the last of the short-faced bear species. They are roughly the same size as an American black bear, perhaps a little bit smaller than that, with grown adults weighing between 140 and 175 kilograms. They are largely herbivorous, so less than 5% of their diet typically comes from meat sources. They occasionally scavenge. And the rest of their diet comes from plant species. So bromeliads, for example, a tropical plant family, comprises most of their diet. They, as you might have guessed, reside in the Andean Mountains in South America. So their range stretches as far south as Bolivia and as far north as Venezuela, with populations also occurring in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. And so for my research, I am looking at conservation efforts that are ongoing in Colombia. They are considered vulnerable by IUCN. I have the chart up there just in case you needed a reminder. There are approximately 20,000 Andean bears left in the wild, distributed across all 5 countries. Approximately 8,000 of those reside in Colombia. These are really rough estimates though. There actually has been no rigorous population estimates done to date for the species range-wide. Though there is some evidence that their populations are decreasing. So they are a protected species in all 5 of these countries. It's forbidden to hunt them. However, that's not enforced to any great effect, unfortunately. And so for a variety of reasons, they are predicted to be endangered by the year 2030. Some of the threats that they're facing are the ever so present habitat loss and fragmentation. Poaching is also an issue, as I alluded to. And then there's also this issue of institutional capacity. And that's actually listed as a specific threat to Andean bears in the Conservation Action Plan. And I found that kind of interesting, so I started looking more at this problem, and I learned some things. So for instance, in Colombia, there was a restructuring of natural resource management. Between the last 15 and 20 years, they went from one large agency that oversaw all of the environmental issues of the country to smaller agencies that are more regional in nature. And so this seems like a good thing at first. Perhaps it's a little less unwieldy, more effective to have an organization that's closer to the problems. However, they're also now dealing with issues of limited finances. These regional agencies don't really have the personnel to tackle the problems that are appearing within their domain. In response to this, Bernard, who wrote this Conservation Action Plan, promoted the collaboration of environmental organizations and agencies to kind of pool their resources to effectively produce conservation outcomes. And something does seem to have come of this. For instance, the Wildlife Conservation Society has partnered with the National Park Service, and together they are working on issues of Andean bear management. However, I traveled to Colombia this summer, and something that I learned is this is not regularly the case. For instance, we met with some local grassroots organizations, and they seemed to be somewhat in the dark about what others were up to as far as Andean bear conservation goes. And so this caught my interest and led me to ask the question, how does conservation network structure impact Andean bear conservation in Colombia? I had to put bounds on my research project, and so there are actually 3 ranges of the Andes in Colombia, and I will just be looking at efforts on the eastern range or the eastern Cordillera. My first objective to answer this overarching question is to identify which network configurations produce more successful conservation outcomes. I'll do this by constructing a social network analysis. So I need to do semi-structured interviews with relevant individuals who work in the Eastern Cordillera. I will ask them these name-generating questions, like who do you speak to about issues of Andean bear management? Or who do you talk to about issues of landscape management in the Eastern Cordillera more generally? And then along with these questions in the interview, I'll ask them questions about their conservation initiatives, the status of these. Were they successful? Is it still ongoing? Did you have to abandon any previous project? And if there were any other collaborators involved with these efforts. And with these 2 things, I aim to analyze successful motifs, they're called, which are these smaller breakdowns of the network into more manageable bits. So partnerships between 3, 4, 5 organizations you can examine on this scale. You can organize them by different characteristics. With the red and green, I'm not sure what that group was trying to go with, but you could do like local organization, international organization, etc. And try to assess which of these configurations is correlated with the most successful outcomes. The other thing I'll be able to do is create a null model to compare against the entire social network. So I'll be able to assess whether or not centrality is higher than could be expected by chance, for instance. And so looking at the structure is all fine, but what we really want to know is why, right? Why is it structured that way? Why are some collaborations happening? Why are others in the dark? And so for that, I'm moving to a more qualitative analysis to identify motivations for and barriers to collaborative efforts. So again, more qualitative analysis of that interview data. I'll feed it into a coding software program such as MaxQDA, and do in vivo coding for themes related to each of these things, related to motivations, deterrence, etc. And then tangential to this, I'm also going to ask questions about other limitations to conservation success. And my idea with this is try to critically assess whether or not some of these other limitations could potentially be overcome by strategic partnerships. So in the future, I hope to bring more ecology into this project. And so if you bear with me, social networks are a form of social connectivity, if you will. So I'm interested in the intersection of social and ecological connectivity. And so you can imagine these organizations have specific areas on the landscape that they're focused on, that they're managing. So you can very easily map those on a map and kind of just draw lines between those that are communicating based on the social network. Then you can assess whether or not any ecological process is tying these together. The ecological process of interest to me would be whether or not Andean bears are moving from place to place. And if they are, then perhaps those two places should be collaborating more effectively to ensure that this process can be maintained. So you can identify areas of overlap where they are communicating, and discontinuity where perhaps Andean bears are passing through the territory, but that manager is not in communication with the rest of the network. You can identify those areas for then what's called strategic network weaving, which is bringing them into the fold, trying to establish some communications, basically strengthening the network structure to improve Andean bear conservation. So I'd like to thank my funders that gave me money to visit Colombia this last summer. Of course, my advisors, Bob and Nate, and Dr. Rocio Granados, who is actually an ICON alumnus. She was willing and very gracious to put me up for the summer in Colombia. So take any questions.